Yeah, thanks for coming to this. It's, I don't get down to New Zealand very often. I wish more. I've met a lot of Kiwis the last couple of weeks, and I try to tell them, like, you can't appreciate where you live unless you've been to other countries. You guys have got it down. So, anyway, this is, hopefully, it's an informal talk. And so as interactive as it can be and as you like. So feel free to jump in any point, any time. You've probably all been to some, well, let me ask sort of who we have in the room. How many of you would call yourselves a product owner? Product owner. How many would call yourselves, if you're not a product owner, product manager? And how many would call yourself some form of designer, UX designer? Couple. How many would classify themselves as an engineer? Anything else in the room? Coach maybe, something like that? You, data science, data analyst, maybe? No? So mostly product. I'm always interested in different sort of patterns around the world. And one of the ones that I have seen in my couple weeks down here has been a lot of the separation of product manager, product owner. Just to be clear, that's not a good thing. You want to make sure, the job is product manager. The role you play on an agile team is product owner. When you separate those two, lots of bad things happen. Most importantly, it's almost impossible to innovate. Now that's kind of a more basic conversation. We can have it if you want. This is more of a little more advanced talk about some of the harder things. But let me just say, if you're a product owner and not the product manager, you're probably just a backlog administrator. And honestly, to be truthful, and that is not really an interesting job to talk about, and it's really not what you want on your CV, on your bio, on your LinkedIn profile. You want to be a product manager if you get into this area. The product manager is the #1 path in our industry to startup CEO. So that's not an accident. So it's a very different role. And I just want to be clear, I'm talking about the product manager job. In some companies, that's the same as product owner. It's a synonymous thing. But I've noticed in New Zealand, and I think I understand why, you have a large heritage with banks here. Banks kind of are not good examples of product generally. And so they have this separation of those two. That used to be the same thing in New York too, but we had the financial industry had a big meltdown about 10 years ago, and they really ended up coming out much stronger, and they really redefined the role. So anyway, what I thought I'd do is just, there are a bunch of questions that I often get that are honestly not the kind of questions if you're giving a talk that you normally hope anybody asks. They're those ones that don't have a clean, crisp, clear answer. And but they're honestly ones that people who have actually been practicing product at good companies usually run into. And so I just decided to kind of get out all those on the table. You can't really have, this is, like you say, a little more of a second order conversation, so it kind of assumes a foundation in product. But I think it's useful to get them out on the table. And we talk about how good teams really tackle these. They're also all topics I'm kind of working on articulating a good answer to. This is kind of where I get a lot of my newsletter, or I write blog posts every couple weeks, and this is where I get a lot of my ideas, is from the teams I work with when they ask a hard question, and I see that same issue in other places. So you're getting a preview here on a lot of the things that I'm thinking about and writing about and trying out ideas with others, but they're all pretty hard questions. That's why I put them on the list. Don't let that stop you from asking those. There's a more fundamental one it's worth talking about. Okay, so they're not in any particular order. I just kind of grouped them in a kind of a logical way. You already heard about me, and so I won't spend time on that, but I will. product people come to product from different areas. I came from the engineering side. That's where I was trained, and I spent the first decade of my career writing software. And a lot of product people come from that perspective, usually because we're frustrated with our product managers. We're like, they don't know what they're doing. I can do at least as well as that person can do. And sometimes people come from different parts of the business, same thing, they're frustrated with the product person's like, I can learn that, I can do that. So they come from all over. But there is a meme out there right now which is referred to as the product manager is the CEO of the product. You heard that before? And some people hate that, honestly, because, and I've gone through stages where I haven't liked it either, but it's because the reason people don't like it is because when the person tries to act like the boss of everybody. That's not what it is about. In fact, by definition and by design, the product manager is not the boss of anybody. So, and there's a couple reasons for that, but it is mostly because the job is way too much work to also add on top of that managing people. And frankly, designers, engineers don't want to work for a product manager. They want to work for somebody who can make them better designer or better engineer. So it doesn't work well if the product manager is the boss. But what it really refers to is this person really is the CEO of the product in the sense that they have that holistic view of their product. They understand how the product is built, how it's marketed, how it's sold, how it's delivered, what the sales constraints are, privacy considerations, security considerations. They understand all these elements, the financial aspects, so that they can make decisions. And that's why if you're not also the product manager, if you're just the product owner, how could you make any of those decisions? You end up basically just escalating everything up to somebody who does understand the business. And this is where a lot of CEOs complain to me about their product owners. They just complain that they don't understand anything about the business. They're just an administrator. Or the other pathology is that they schedule a meeting for every decision and they invite all the stakeholders in a room and then it's designed by committee. And that's also fatal to products. So I'm talking about somebody who really steps up and learns the different aspects of the business. This is really what the product manager brings to his or her team. That the designer brings obvious skills, engineers bring obvious skills, but this is the big thing a product manager brings. All right, so anyway, there are a number of topics around people, and I just thought I'd start with those. The first one is really, it sounds kind of basic, but it's a pretty subtle question, but what really does the product manager get to decide? And to be clear, through this whole hour or so, when I say product manager, I'm including the product ownership responsibilities. All right, so what do they get to decide? What is up to me and what is up to others? And there are really 4 different scenarios that we need to talk about. And in truth, a lot of the I'm an advisor. My main job is an advisor to about anywhere between 10 and 15 companies at once, depending on what stage they're at. And a lot of what I do is I'm helping the head of product or the head of the product people at those companies just to get better at their job. And a lot of the difficult questions are really about this. Now, also part of this is just about working with people and this sort of emotional intelligence. And I do tell a lot of product people they need to pick their battles, You don't have to fight everybody on everything. You can just decide what's important. But there are these 4 different dimensions. The first, and really the one that's most prevalent, is what does the product manager decide versus the other members of the product manager's team? So just to be clear, a typical product team is product manager, product designer, UX designer, and anywhere from 2 to about 12 engineers. That's a typical team. There might be a few others depending on what we're working on, like a data analyst or a user researcher, but in general, that's the core team. So what does the product manager get to decide versus the team? Now, of course, if you've got a strong team, what we're hoping is if it's a design-related question, you defer to the designer. If it's an engineering-related question, you, of course, defer to the engineers. And that is what we're trying to do. Where it gets interesting is when people really disagree. Like even if it's not the product manager, let's say the designer and the tech lead disagree on something, which in a good team they often do. So what do? Who gets to decide? And in a good team, I argue that you run a test. We'll talk about a lot of product today. Techniques are designed to just, let's run a test and figure out the best way to go. Sometimes you can't run a test, or even if you do, you have to make a judgment, and the product manager is on the hook to make that judgment. But this is one of those where if you, in general, if the team agrees, you just go forward, but if they disagree, you figure out the quickest way to collect some evidence and make a decision. Usually if you collect evidence and you look at it together, you agree on what you need to do. Gets a little more interesting, of course, when the product manager disagrees with his or her boss, the head of product, because ultimately the head of product is responsible for that product manager. They're the VP of product or director of product or chief product officer, whatever you'd like to call that person. That is ultimately the most important non-executive role in the company, because they are responsible for the product managers, and the product managers are responsible for the results of the teams. And that's where your products come from. So this is a huge job, the head of product, and they ultimately are responsible for you. Now, if you are brand new to product, they are probably needing to be very prescriptive and coaching, more like daily one-on-ones, that kind of thing. If you're experienced in product, hopefully they're giving you a lot more room. But again, it's a similar answer there, where most of the time you're going to need to defer to the head of product there, and you probably should if the head of product has earned their way there. They've got a lot more experience than you. But if you do disagree on something strong, the answer is we run a test. We run a test. Remember, if it's your opinion versus somebody's opinion who's more senior than you, you generally lose. Right? That's how that works. So if the answer is we run a test. And by the way, that's fundamentally changed how we do product at good companies. Another big one, and probably the most struggle for so many product people, is the product manager versus the stakeholders, right? The different, like the vice president of merchandising, marketing, or banking, or whatever it might be. Those stakeholders, of course, are usually pretty senior people, and in a bad company, the product managers just, they view their job as to serve the stakeholders. In fact, it's usually phrased as, we're there to serve the needs of the business. If you've ever heard that phrase, that's not a product company, that's IT. In a product company, we're actually there to serve our customers in ways that meet the needs of the business. It's a pretty fundamental difference, huge difference. Now, the product manager, this dynamic is really all about the level of trust between the product manager and the stakeholders. And so the onus is on the product manager here to, first of all, convince each stakeholder that you as product manager understand the issues they're dealing with. If it's privacy issues, or financial issues, or brand issues with marketing, it could be whatever. You have to convince them that you understand and appreciate the constraints they're operating under, and that you will only propose to them solutions that work within those constraints. If you can build that relationship, you're good. And that's the kind of trust we're looking for. If you don't have that relationship, it's going to be a long, rough day you'll deal with. And then, of course, the product manager and this versus the CEO. That is, in startups especially, it's a really challenging problem, because honestly, the CEO is usually also the head of product, or even the only product person for a long time. And so that one can be especially sensitive. Where it shows up a lot is the CEO is out there with customers generally every week. And I have to tell, a lot of product managers complain to me that the CEO is always just saying, just do this, just do it. And I'm like, and they're like, I don't think we should do that. And I'm like, well, you tell me, how many customers have you been to in the last month? And they're like, well, I'm busy, we have stand-ups every day. Yes. And the CEO, though, is every week. And I'm like, if I was the CEO, first of all, I don't even think we need you. but we would defer to the CEO. They're the ones that are really doing the hard work, and they are the CEO of the product. They're also the CEO of the company, but they're actually there with the customer. So the first thing you need to do is build your cred with that CEO. And that's why the first obligation really of any product manager is a good 3-4 months of dedicated, really get to know the customers and the users. You need to establish yourself as an expert on your users and customers, to the point where the CEO believes that, I should check with that person, see what they think. Because they know that you're learning with customers every day. You're not just making this stuff up, it's not just your opinion. So that's critical. The product managers that earn that respect, and of course, once you've earned it with the CEO, you've got it with the stakeholders. I mean, these are the ones that people mean the CEO of the product. These are the ones, and I'll go a little further. I tell CEOs that every one of their product managers, they should know who they are by name, and they should believe that every one of the product managers are future leaders of your company. You know, at Google, they literally expect that 50% of their product managers will leave to become startup CEOs. And they say that's a sign that they're hiring the right people as product manager. Even though that's an awful high turnover, but that's a sign. Similarly, when they acquire a startup, the co-founder usually becomes a product manager. So this is a hard job, it's a high bar. All right, so that's a common issue, for sure. Here's a big one. I'm in meetings all day, and I hear this all the time. I mean, and it's correlated to the bigger the company, more this is a problem. A lot of people complain to me they are literally booked wall to wall, we say. From like, you show up in the morning at 8:30 and you're booked till 6 p.m. There's really two answers to this. Well, the truth is, and this is rough, but it takes 4 hours a day of quality time to actually do this job. And that's just the honest truth. 4 hours of real time. That is not like, on email or on Slack or on, definitely not talking about Facebook and Instagram. I mean, literally this is to do your job. It's 4 hours a day. Now, there's really two ways I see successful product people doing that. And I want to be honest with you. I don't endorse the first one, but I'm guilty of it too, which is they get those 4 hours from like 6 at night to 10 at night. This is a huge problem in Silicon Valley. I mean, you can go by any of the best companies, you'll see the cars there late at night, and that's basically the only time they have to get something done. So they're working now. Now, you pretty much give up your social life if you do that, but that is one way to do it. The other way of doing it is stop going to all these meetings, really. And I sit down with so many people, product managers, and we'll go through their calendar, and I'll point out to them how most of these meetings, they actually don't need to be there. It's just this thing that so many people feel like, well, if I'm CEO of the product, then I have to be at every meeting anybody's talking about my product, but it's totally not true. It's like, do you really want the CEO at every meeting about the product? Probably not. So it's, you've got to let go and pick your battles with your time. I will tell you a lot of, and this has come harder than it's ever been, mostly because of these things, right? Teams at all these great companies have got very good at interrupting us. And I think by far the most valuable productivity tool today is airplane mode. You got to turn it on, you got to get, I'm not here to tell you how to do this, it's so personal, but one way or another, I'm just being honest, you need 4 hours a day. You can do it however you want. But without those 4 hours a day, I don't believe you're going to succeed. Ben Horowitz likes to say, today we have successful product managers and former product managers. It's a brutal job today, and that's a big reason why. All right. We can't find enough engineers or designers. I hear this issue a lot. And I haven't, in fairness, I haven't seen this as the big issue in New Zealand. It's a big issue in a lot of the world, but I just will say remote employees, well, if you've got to, the only job you really want to do that with is remote engineers if you have to, but Contractors are even worse. So we don't want contractors. There's a great quote in the product world, which is, we need teams of missionaries, not teams of mercenaries. And contractors, they're all, by definition, they're mercenaries, right? So they're not going to be missionaries if they're contractors. And you can use agencies if you have to too. Don't get me wrong, if you told me I can't find a designer no matter what, but we do have budget, I would say, okay, I'll introduce you to an agency. They'll take care of you. It's not the same as if you have a designer you're sitting right next to every day, so it's not as good, but it's a lot better than not having a designer. Even more, it's a lot better than the product manager pretending to be a designer, which is another big issue we have. Your job, to be clear, is not to do wireframes. This is a hot topic, as you know, around, especially in the US right now, and it's a long overdue topic. But I think teams for 10 years have been trying to be politically correct and trying to get more balanced teams, but now they're actually getting a lot more serious because I think there's a lot more pressure to get serious about this. And there's also a lot of evidence that shows diverse teams actually do work a lot better. I just shared one of the best theoretical analyses that were done by a really great thinker in this area on Twitter if you're interested. But if you're serious about getting diversity in your teams, then the biggest thing is you cannot count on HR to help you. It won't happen through HR. This happens only when the person who's looking to hire, it's like the director of product or directors of engineering, they have to make it happen. They have to literally take responsibility for going out and sourcing. The talent really is out there. This is an amazing thing. And most of the time, you don't even have to look beyond your own company. Most of the time, the talent is in your company, but they're buried in these other roles. And you need to find somebody, if you find people that are the right talent, in particular for product managers, it's smart, creative, persistent. If you're interested in that, I've got lots of writings on that. But then you've got to go convince them that they're actually capable and well-suited for this job. And this is just one of those things too. I'm not pretending I really understand all the reasons why, but I have definitely observed, as many others, a lot of women don't think they're qualified. And even though they're way more qualified than their male counterparts that are applying, it's that, there's data behind this that men will look at a job description that says you need 3 years of experience. If they have 1 year, they consider, I'm good. A woman needs to have 4 years before she'll feel comfortable actually applying. So you just have to go and say, trust me, you should apply. And the other thing is, don't wait until you're, there's a company, it's a great company, really good company, but they did not make any effort early on. And I don't think it was anything overt. It was just that classic, they hired people that looked like them. Classic. And so pretty soon you had a large company of people that all looked alike. And so what happened was, now it's like I introduced them to this amazing female engineer, actually, and she talked to me afterwards. She said, like, oh my God, I would be literally not just the only woman on the team, I would be the only woman in the entire department. And I'm like, I don't want to be that person. Who wants to be that person? She just really brought that point home. It's a lot easier to do this if you start small, when you're smaller, and build a balanced org. Process topics. A little bit of a process walk. We'll get into these things. So the first one, some of you may have heard the term Dualtrack. Has anybody heard that term, Dualtrack? There's actually a guy that has been coming to New Zealand for several years, Jeff Patton. Has anybody heard of him and seen him? He's a longtime friend of mine, one of my favorite agile coaches actually out there. He's also a discovery coach, but he's the one who actually shared that term originally with me. But the idea here is, for those that don't know, is that in general, that we start with business objectives. The purpose of product discovery is to come up with a solution that actually works for our business and for our customers. I'll talk about what that means in a minute. And then we actually deliver that, building a reliable product for our customers that we can ship. That's the idea here. Now, the truth is, the reason you may not have heard the term Dualtrack is because like everybody calls it something else. Of the good companies that work, they all like build the right product versus build the product right. Some of you may have heard that phrase. Google, for years, from earliest Google, fake it before you make it, they refer fake it, make it. Facebook, move fast, don't break things, that's what they like to call it. Build things that don't scale, build things that do scale, that's what Airbnb likes to call it, they got that from Y Combinator. Customer development versus product development, that's in the lean startup world. Design sprints versus delivery sprints, that's in the design thinking world. And continuous discovery, continuous delivery is kind of what I refer to it mostly as, but they're all describing the same thing. That's the point, they're all describing the same thing. And this, I would argue, is fundamentally different than the sort of waterfall way of working that almost every team, including almost every team that's using Agile, is really running. So that's another discussion. Let me just make a couple points about that. So some engineers try to claim that that way of working I just showed you is Agile, is waterfall. But this is important that they understand why it's not. So really the way to understand that is what does it really mean to be a waterfall process? And this is, you can start to see why teams often are using Agile, but they're really not because of this. Three things. First of all, if you think the way it's supposed to work is the product manager defines user stories or some other form of specification, and then a designer designs experiences, user interfaces, for example, and then the engineers build, they get that, they see what we're supposed to do in sprint planning, and then they build, that's waterfall. I mean, that is one of the defining characteristics of waterfall. Second is, if the result of your effort is to ship a feature from a roadmap or a project or any kind of gizmo, that is output. That's waterfall, output. Product needs to be about results. We'll talk about that. And then finally, if you don't really know if what you're building is going to work for your customers or for your stakeholders until after you've built it, that's waterfall. Those are really the three defining characteristics of waterfall. So let's talk about how this way of working doesn't do that. This is how you really test, however you're working, if it's got the benefits you're looking for. First of all, we are tackling our risks up front. That's the purpose of discovery, tackling value risk, usability risk, feasibility risks, and viability, business viability risks. That's what we're doing in discovery. We're actually defining collaboratively. Product design and engineering are figuring out what to do side by side in this give and take. And finally, it's all about business outcomes, hitting a KPI or solving a business problem, and not shipping features. Most teams I work with are doing continuous delivery. They are releasing many times a day. So a release is a non-event. What matters, we may have to release 5 versions of a feature before it actually works well enough that it solves the problem. That's what we mean. So these are the characteristics that we're looking for. And all of those ways we talked about working, build things that don't scale, then build things that do scale, they're all designed around these 3 things. All right. This is a little tricky, but important, because a lot of people, have you seen this diagram? This is like one of the best Agile coaches in the world, in my opinion, a guy named Henrik Nieberg. Is that how you say it, Nieberg? Another guy Jeff Patton introduced me to, but he came up with this to try to show teams really, and the idea here, and I will also say, the metaphor they picked of skateboards to cars is not the greatest metaphor. A lot of people get hung up on that and say, well, why in the world would you build a skateboard if you're, trying to do a car? What's the point of that? So, and I try to tell people, get past that. If you want a better example they could have picked that I often use with teams is pretend you're designing a SmartWatch. SmartWatch is a good example right now because everybody's still trying to figure out what is going to make a great smartwatch. And so, if it was a smartwatch we're trying to get to, then it's really about what the capabilities really need to be, the form factors need to be, what are the traits, and so that's a more realistic maybe example of this. But and so his point is, all right, if we're trying to build a smartwatch, we could just build the time part, and then we could just build. No, I mean you wouldn't know anything about what you have until you spent way too long. And his point is, no, let's make every iteration something valuable. Or at least, not necessarily something valuable, but something testable, right? Testable. And then we can see. And then maybe this version of the smartwatch is great and does what we need. Maybe it needs this version, something like that. Now, the thing is, that is better than not doing anything different. It's certainly better than this. We say at least it's not what we call a big bang release. But this is hardly what a product team would do, a good product team. Here's how we would do that. In this sort of two-way of working, discovery and delivery in parallel. In discovery, we would figure out the value. We would figure out what solution would have the value we need, what solution would have the design or usability we need, the feasibility and the viability. Now we do that through rapid experimentation. That's what prototypes are for. That's what we have quantitative and qualitative techniques around all of these risks. This is what modern product is today. And then once we know the combination of features that's necessary for this smartwatch, for our, say, first deliverable, releasable smartwatch, then we can have engineering build that how they see fit. If they actually wanted to build it by infrastructure first, that'd be fine. If it was a smartwatch, for example, would you really want them to do 5 different infrastructures? No. That'd be a big waste of their time. They wouldn't want to. So that, and of course, what the engineers in delivery are worried about is a very different set of issues. Things like scale, reliability, performance, maintainability, security, accuracy, privacy. Those are the considerations in delivery. Does this make sense? This is really what we're trying to do in a good product team. We tackle what the product needs to be in discovery, and then we tackle the best way to deliver it in delivery. But it's up to your engineers on delivery. It's up to product and design on discovery. If that makes sense to you, you're way ahead of the game for most. This would be what good product teams are really doing. Just to give you another little data point. Most teams in delivery, they might be doing, if they're doing Scrum, it might be weekly sprints, or maybe every 2-week sprints. In discovery, we'll do on the order of 15 to 30 iterations per week. Okay, so discovery, the order, it's at least an order of magnitude, if not 2 orders faster. And of course, we're going that fast because we're not building real stuff. We're just prototyping, and there's even 4 major kinds of prototypes for the different kinds of risks that we're tackling. Feel free to jump in anywhere too. So once in a while, we'll get this. My engineers just want to build. And that's kind of the other end of the schedule problem. So first of all, they should be building on the order of 90% of their time. They should be building. That's their highest and best use. Assuming you have serious developers, not we say IT developers. In Silicon Valley, IT does not mean, here I find IT is this general term for like any kind of technology. In Silicon Valley, IT is very distinct from product engineering. IT is like, it's not where the professionals go. The professionals all work in the product. To be honest, there's a dramatic difference in what the engineers are paid. They're not even usually called engineers in the IT. And honestly, if it's truly IT, we give it to Accenture, because that's their business, is to do internal. But for, engineers should be doing on the order of 90%. And another big key is that often product managers think it's their job to shelter them from the sort of ugliness of the real world. They don't want them to see the customer pain. They think that'll demotivate them. And I have to explain this to product people all the time. That's exactly backwards. The best way to motivate engineers is to show them your customer's in serious pain. So if you have that, which many of us do, you have a product where the customers are not happy, the best thing you can do is bring along a developer to see that. We don't bring all the developers at once, but once each time we go to a customer, we like to bring a different developer. And then all we're looking for, even 15 minutes a day to participate in the discovery activities makes a world of difference. So we don't need a lot of time, but we need some time every day. If it's a truly co-located team, it usually happens on its own. All right. We're in a regulated industry, banking, healthcare. What do? Well, we have great techniques for regulated industries. There is a really important quote, which is the riskiest thing you can do is not take risks. I want to be clear, we have to do this experimentation to move forward. The first thing we do is we leverage opt-in techniques where customers or users volunteer to do that. That can be just by clicking something on your website, or it could be signing an NDA, whatever you want. But if they consciously click it, that everybody from lawyers to stakeholders are much more comfortable. So there's no problem with that. We can also lower our expectations on degree of confidence. So instead of statistically significant results, we'll just look for evidence. That's fine. Again, we'd much rather collect some data than just make guesses. And we'll lean a lot more on the qualitative techniques and not as much on the quantitative techniques. But we do it. We do it. And if anybody thinks they're in a business that they can't do this kind of experimentation, I would encourage you to contact me, because I would almost certain that's not the case, that I can convince you can do it. And if you really are in an industry that you can't do it, then you really want to find another industry, because that is not probably long for the world. Yeah. All right. Yep.
I just wanted to say, talk about the IT bit for a second. The company I work for, we're trying to treat our internal customers just like we treat our external customers. And so product managers are involved in developing product for internal customers. And one thing which is great, because you've got an audience there that you control to a degree, and you get a lot of feedback from them, and really they care about the company a lot as well. So, I've heard also that Google do this. So, for example, Google, their intranet is like the most advanced of their search engine. Their latest technology that they're going to put out to customers for the search engine goes onto their intranet.
That's called dog fooding.
Yeah.
That's what it is. We eat our own dog food, and Google does that. Almost everybody does. That's, but that's a little different. So that's a little different. That just says we use our own products first, and that's fine. But you're getting at, so first of all, that would be great. I will tell you, even Google doesn't really do what we're talking about for all their internal efforts. No, and honestly, it's not because people don't want to, it's because most companies can't afford to. They don't have enough good product managers for their customer-facing things. They don't have enough designers for their customer-facing things. So, and if they have to choose between their customers and their employees, they're like, well, we can hold the hands of the employees, and by the way, we're paying them. So we can kind of get away with that. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying if you had to choose. But that said, like a team came to me from Apple, this was a couple years ago, and said, you know, we've realized that the big bottleneck in our stores, in the Apple store, and I realize you don't have an Apple store actually in New Zealand. Fix that. The stores are actually amazing. You know, they're the #1 in terms of revenue per square foot in the world. They're just amazing stores. So you get out of the country, visit one. But they realized one of the bottlenecks was the people in the back office that are trying to support that. They're called geniuses in the Apple store. And so they did a whole new set of tools for them. Now I want to be clear, even though those are employees, that's considered first-class product. because those are called customer enabling products. In other words, if you're doing a tool for an employee that is taking care of the actual paying customers, that's product experience. The test is simple. If it goes down, does it immediately impact your customers? If the answer is yes, this product. And a lot of internal tools are in that bucket. And those usually are the next priority. And then the third are those that are truly not impacting the customer experience. So those are usually called true IT. And I honestly don't know many companies that have the money and staff to do what we're talking about for those, even though I would love to see that. It's just that, and if they did, you could absolutely use these techniques. And to your point, it's easier. Yep. Yep.
Quick question on discovery. So we're doing a lot of discovery on objectives, and it's going really well. And we thought it was going really well. The product and design to engineers yesterday had this, we did a solutions offsite thing, and they said, "Oh, we're really frustrated because you're not involving us." And there was a big discussion of, well, what stage would you like to be involved? Is it an ad hoc thing? Because at the very stage, there's a lot of ambiguity. We don't have really defined what the problem is to solve.
But your engineers are spot on right. If they feel like they're not being involved, no matter what, something's wrong. You want them to feel involved. Otherwise, they're not going to feel like missionaries. There is no time that is too early to involve them. You, in fact, ideally, the designer and the engineers are seeing it when it's a sparkle in your eye, just the very earliest. And again, it's because this is the little secret in product. But consistently, the best single source of innovation is not our customers, it's not our executives, it's not the product managers, it's the engineers. But that only is true if they're there, and they have to see the customer paying. And the reason that's the case is because they're working with the technology every single day, so it puts them in the best position to see what's just now possible. So yeah, you definitely want to include them, especially your most senior engineers. That's usually part of the job description of being promoted from an engineer to a tech lead, is that they are participating in discovery. Yeah.
So who should do your prototyping? Is it the engineers themselves if they've got prototyping skills? Should you do wireframes first, or are hi-fi prototypes good?
In truth, I normally need 2 days to answer that question because there are lots and lots of scenarios. Depends on the kind of risk. There's 4 kinds of prototypes. I will tell you though, as a general rule, it's almost never the engineers that do it. We don't need them to. It's much faster and cheaper for the designer to do it. There are great tools out there that are designed for designers to be able to create these different kinds of prototypes. There are a couple exceptions to that actually do use the engineers, and because that's not their highest and best use, we minimize. We only use those when we need to. But normally we want our engineers to be able to focus on delivery work, which is really super hard work, and only they can do. And we want the designer, again, this is another common problem, is not having enough designer capability. And so in terms of, if you don't have designer, that leads to another pathology, which is the product manager creating wireframes. Yeah, but the real issue there is you need a designer. Yeah.
How do you optimize the time that engineers spend in discovery? If we want them to have 90% of their time actually doing the delivery, how do we really make the best use of them within the discovery piece?
Well, it's only if you're a truly co-located team, you don't even have to worry about it. They're right there when the discussions are happening. If they're not, if they're remote, then you need to plan usually 30 minutes a day. A lot of teams will just add it on after the stand-up or one way or another, and then what we're asking them to do is play with the prototypes that are in discovery. So we just want to make sure that they don't know a better way to solve this, and also they can start thinking very early about feasibility and cost. Another way of phrasing this is, if the first time your engineers see an idea is at sprint planning, you have totally messed this up. Okay, they should have seen it long before that. Yeah.
What are your engineers' value designs when you don't give us those designers the engineers?
Oh, well, I hadn't heard that one for a while. There is a whole book written about that problem. It's called The Inmates Are Running the Asylum. That gives you a sign. And by the way, that was written by one of the most famous engineers. He was the chief architect at Microsoft for Microsoft Visual Basic, which was a really groundbreaking product, Alan Cooper. And he wrote that book because he realized the reason so much product is so bad is because it's being actually designed by engineers, which are the worst people to actually be doing this. Now, I was trained as an engineer too. And the reason is because in computer science, we're trained for the way to represent problems the way a computer can represent a problem, not how users think about issues, which is really the difference between how interaction designers are trained. So that's not a good answer either. And most modern engineers will push back on that. They'll say, like, come on, where's the designer? It's just going to be a waste. So, okay, good questions. All right, so a couple product topics. Our execs are addicted to roadmaps. Yeah. It's a huge problem. And just to be clear, roadmaps are, if you don't know this already, roadmaps are evil. The reason they're so evil is because they are really the antithesis of Agile. That's the kind of the irony. Because roadmaps are locking us into features and projects sometimes as long as a year out. Like, how Agile is this? Normally, I give the guideline which says that the problem with that is at least half the items on that roadmap are not going to work out for your customers. They're not going to actually deliver what you had hoped. I was just recently with the Google Cloud team, and they shared with me, no, their number they're using now is 90% won't work. On average, for every 10 ideas they have and try, only one works out. So that's like a really good team, right? Not a bad team. So, if you believe that or anything even close to that, then roadmaps are pure evil, right? So if they were just ideas, that'd be fine, but they're never just ideas. The reason they're so evil is because people want them because they want to know when things are going to happen and what's going to ship. They want to know they want to try to run a business. So there's reasonable needs, but roadmaps themselves are really a source of problems. Now, one way of dealing with that is, we really refer to this as weaning an organization off of roadmaps. And that is, for an outcome-based roadmap looks like a regular roadmap. It's kind of got time frames and but instead of listing a feature like integrate PayPal, we list a business result, improve conversion rate, whatever the underlying reason for doing the feature or project would be. And the idea here is for the next year or so, every time you reference the feature integrate PayPal, you also reference the KPIs that are used to measure if it works. And especially when you push that live. When you finally push that integration or whatever it is live, you say, all right, we pushed PayPal live. Unfortunately, it hasn't moved the conversion rate, but we're going to watch it, and we have other ideas for doing that. So what we're trying to do is move the dialogue from features, output, right, to business results. That's I actually have another one coming on this, so hold that thought. This is another one, I don't know how. Jared Spool, some of you may have heard, is another like Alan Cooper. He's kind of a big design thinker in the design community. And he, a few months ago, he said something very provocative, and it really caused a lot of designers to freak out. He said anybody who influences the design becomes a designer. And of course, I know where he was coming from and what he was trying to say, because first of all, he runs an agency, a design agency. And the biggest complaint in a design agency are your clients telling you what to build. Because not only is it waterfall, it leads to really bad design. And everybody in a design agency hates that. That's the problem with that kind of business. But just to be clear, that literally this is very much not true. The way there's a difference between requirements and constraints, and this is really where product managers earn their keep. So everybody all over, sales, marketing, customers, engineers. The example he cited in his when he explained this more, because he got beat up quite a lot. He said, look, an engineer comes back and says, this is gonna take 10 seconds. They're a designer. I'm like, no, they've identified a constraint. This is gonna take 10 seconds. A designer is, what they do is solve for constraints. They might have to change the experience because it's gonna take 10 seconds instead of the normal like half-second response. So they might have to design a different UI. That's what designers do. But that does not make the engineer a designer, it just makes them another person that introduced a constraint. What good product managers do is that they understand the difference between constraints and requirements. You might have somebody say, oh, I work in legal and you have to put this, or what a classic one is, we can't follow this process, we have to follow this process. And of course, the truth is, in most of the cases, that's not the case. That's what they're assuming is the consequence. But what's really going on is there's some things you have to do and some things you can't do. And the product manager needs to dig in with that lawyer to understand what degrees of freedom exist there and identify what the real constraints are. Yeah, this came up in a very real case in one of the companies I was working with recently where they got a whole list of all these requirements having to do with credit cards and handling. And then they were really bizarre requirements. And I'm like, this is not normal. None of the other e-commerce companies are doing this. What's going on? And anyway, they dug in, and what was really going on was somebody was worried about something called, I think it's PCI compliance, but the point was they can't actually store some of this stuff on their premise. And that was the constraint. It's like, okay, that's not hard. We don't have to do that. There's a lot of other ways of solving that, but that's very different than the requirement somebody might have assumed. All right. So constraints do come from everywhere. I just want to be very clear. And this is really, again, what it means to be CEO of a product. They understand these constraints. You notice there are usually stakeholders for each of these areas. And the product managers need to understand these. This is what they bring to the team. All right. How about this one? Tech debt. How many of you would say you're struggling to some significant degree with tech debt? Yeah, a lot of you. At least half of you. The other half probably don't want to admit it in the public. This is really a problem. To be honest, it's always been a problem, but now we have the combination of Agile, which only makes it worse, faster, and also the world, just the unprecedented growth in the internet market worldwide. I was actually just in Shanghai recently. Do you know that there are 750 million active internet users in China alone? Think about that number. How many? There's like 4 million Kiwis. There's 300 million Americans. But, 4 million Kiwis, maybe 3 million internet active, I don't know. But think of that, almost 750 million. It's so massive there. But, and all of the companies there are struggling with tech debt, basically. If they have any degree of success, it grows like crazy. So, first of all, tech debt needs to be treated very seriously. It is what we call a business continuity issue because it truly kills many companies. And we, of course, need to, when you get into serious issues, we need to dial up the engineers that are focused on this and honestly dial down a lot of the product work because you're not going to be able to get much out till you get this under control. The other thing is if you do this, you have to pick your battles. You can't keep shipping all these useless features. You have to make sure that what you're working on is really going to make a difference. All right. OKRs. How many of you have heard of OKRs? All right, more than half of you, good. Well, it stands for Objectives and Key Results. It's not the only outcome-based performance management system, but it's the one that is most, sort of hit a tipping point. Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, they've all been using it for more than a decade, so it's really kind of very popular and spread because of that. But they're also pretty simple conceptually. Qualitative objectives, quantitative key results. Every team has somewhere between 1 and 3 of them a quarter. It's not that hard, but it is really hard for so many teams to actually do that. And the reason that's the case is because it really is a cultural change. The technique itself is simple, but the technique actually forces a cultural change. And that's where companies struggle. Because this is really the big reason they're so good and people want them is because they want to empower teams. So this is really the alternative to roadmaps. How empowered is a team if you give them a roadmap? You can't hold them accountable for that because they didn't pick what was on the roadmap. So if it doesn't deliver results, are you going to blame the team? Most people realize they can't. So they want to be able to empower teams and hold them accountable. So that means they have to give the team the ability to make these decisions. So then what do you give the teams? You give them prioritized business objectives, business problems to solve. And that process brings to the surface a lot of the real issues, like why won't they empower teams? Where is the trust here? Oh, well, maybe it's because the product manager doesn't actually understand the business, so how can they make the decisions? This is why whenever you have this situation that's so common in so many large companies where there are business people that understand the business, and there are product people that understand technology, but of course product needs both. It's where it comes together. So again, that's another reason why there's a high bar for product managers. All right. And the last sort of set of topics is culture topics, which this OKR one was leading into. Yeah, this is a common one. Our culture is getting more risk averse as we grow. It's like, that's why banks are usually the most risk averse companies out there. In fairness, there's a lot of assets, so there's a lot more to lose. When you're a startup, you don't have much to lose. I remember early Airbnb was just a blast because, we say they were flying under the radar. Nobody really cared about them. But now, they've made a massive dent in the whole travel industry. And it's no secret, they were public about it, but the big players in the travel industry, like Marriott, the hotel company, they funded lobbyists. Just like, I think it was 4 weeks ago, in San Francisco, Airbnb had to cut the number of listings in half because they were finally made to follow the law. But because when they were little, nobody really cared, but now they have to follow the law because they have a lot, now they're a serious player. And so there is more to lose. The CEO of the product becomes a lot more relevant. Or how about Uber? You've all probably read about, well, separate from all the cultural issues at Uber, that has been a terrible, terrible example of company culture, but in terms separate from all that, they have struggled around the world. In many different parts of the world, they've been shut down. And because they weren't really following the laws. And now product is a much harder job at Uber. They have to figure out ways to do what they do. It's never been hard for them to make an app that's good for riders and an app that's good for drivers. What's been hard is for them to do that in a way that works for the business, the countries, the regulations that they live in. And so that's what they're having to take a lot more seriously now. Yeah. Okay. Engineers are just not excited. Remember, this missionary versus mercenary thing is a very big deal. And so when you don't have those excited engineers, first of all, the best thing you can do is bring them with you to see users and customers struggle in person. You say the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. Second, share all the business context, share all the business KPIs. Now this presumes that you know that. So, and if you're a competent product manager, you do know that. But if you're just a product owner in a business, sort of a backlog management sense, you probably don't know that. But if you're a real product manager, you do know the business context. This is your job. Share that with the team. And again, encourage them not just to build, but to invent solutions, to help come up with the solutions that really work for customers and work for your business. And the thing is, developers like nothing more than to really go. I've seen it so many times, that sort of magic that happens when the developers see the inspiration themselves. At that point, you usually can't stop them. They're gonna do something. All right. My CEO tells me what to build and just trust him, right? That's a common cultural issue. And especially if it's that case where the CEO is the one going to customers and the product manager's not. So first of all, be smart and pick your battles. Don't fight the CEO on everything. Most of those things honestly probably don't matter. And you could probably just do, and it's fine. The ones that are something you think is very important, that's where you need to focus your energy. Do your homework. That is referring to, you've got to go to customers, you've got to understand your business, you've got to understand the data. That's what they're counting on you to do. Be very open with what you learn. That is how the CEO and the other executives realize how much you're learning and know. Good and bad, be very open. And then 2 tools that are hugely valuable when dealing with senior executives. Prototypes. Prototypes are huge. PowerPoint presentations, useless. In fact, worse than useless, they're dangerous because very often when you show a PowerPoint presentation to executives, they say, looks good, sounds good, and then you go build it, and then of course they see the real thing, it's not good. What we want to do is show them a prototype, show them something realistic that they can understand. And then data is hugely powerful. That is the big equalizer, is data. Just run a test, collect some evidence, show them the data. All right. And then finally, is it even possible to really change culture? This is probably the hardest question in all of product right here. And it's one that, and of course I'm not talking about, country culture. That does play a little bit of a role. I remember on my first day in New Zealand, I was with a group of some investor types, and they were saying that one of the characteristics about Kiwis is not a lot of comfort in asking questions and disagreeing. And I haven't actually seen that in practice at least to the extent I was set. And that I would tell you that that makes you nervous because you need that in order to come up with good solutions. But nothing like there's, for example, in Japan, culturally, disagreeing is just really, really difficult. And I find it not an accident there's been so little innovation, at least in the last 20 years out of there. And that's, so there are some cultures where that plays, but mostly what I'm talking about is company culture. And the company cultures come from, I mentioned Uber. Uber has a terrible company culture, still does, honestly. And they realized, this came from the CEO, and it did, and the CEO is no longer with the company. However, that CEO, Travis, hired more than 1,000 managers. And most of those more than 1,000 managers are still at Uber, investing in their stock. They're not going to leave voluntarily. And so what's really going on, now some people, of course, were very publicly, with Travis and they left early on, but most were like, oh, I'm glad he's gone. But they still have the behaviors that Travis hired them for. So that's where culture lives with middle management. And that's where it often gets stuck. Now, because I actually don't personally know the new CEO of Uber, but from what I can tell, he seems like a good sort, much better leader, much more reasonable leader. And I do know a lot of the senior people that he has brought on that are very strong. So I think they're doing what they need to do, but the hard part is they really have to change the behaviors of all of these 1,000+ middle managers. And that is hard. Because it's really hard. What's the test about whether they're really the right people or not? And then you just fire all these, and you have all so many people that don't even have a manager. But realize that if you're an engineer or a product manager or a designer at Uber, what really matters to you about the culture of the company is who you report to. who your manager is and how they develop you or not. And so that's where it matters. And it does take time, and you gotta persist at it. Companies have significantly changed their culture, so that gives me hope. But it's hard. I think it's definitely hard. One of the hardest things I know in our industry. Okay, so that is the new edition. It just came out. I don't even think it's. When I checked, I don't even know if it was on Amazon. I think Amazon New Zealand basically gets it shipped from Australia. So it might be there now, but it would just be there. So although the Kindle version's been there, and in a few weeks the Audible version will be there. I don't know if you guys are into Audible, but Audible's awesome. Yeah, there's also my email right there, and I do write at least once or twice a month an article about the kind of topics I've been talking about. Try to pick hard topics that other people are not tackling. So, okay, what else? We have a little time. Yeah.
The question around support teams or BAU teams versus product teams. What's your opinion on
Support teams, or what else did you call it?
BAU, like business as usual teams, like look after the usual stuff? What do you think about having two teams or one team?
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, sometimes we use the phrase "keep the lights on."
Yeah.
Same idea, I think, as business as usual. So first of all, normal practice is that's all the same team. Now this is kind of important, that if let's say you're at Uber and you're working on that app for drivers, that you would do the keep the lights on, business as usual stuff, you would do bug fixing, you would do performance work, and you would do all the new features and initiative for the driver app. That is normal practice. There's a few cases where it makes sense to have a separate team just doing critical fixes, mostly when there is no team working on that anymore. It's something that's been, what do we call it, when it moves into sustaining mode. In other words, there is no team moving that driver app forward. It's been fine for several years. All we're doing is keeping it running. And then a support team or a bug fix team, or sometimes called a rapid response team. Yeah. There's all kinds of euphemisms, but it's the bug fix team. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
So question on tech debt. Now you gave us a sort of a product view on how you deal with tech debt. I feel like tech debt has a job satisfaction associated with it for the developers. As a developer, if the company doesn't care for tech debt, even if it doesn't pick the product, you don't feel motivated. How do you balance that?
Well, you're saying a developer feels like their company doesn't care about tech debt? Yeah, that would be bad, honestly. And I've actually got to the point where give me 10 minutes with a CEO and I can scare them to death. Because I have so many stories of companies that are no longer with us because of tech debt. Actually, the only reason I'm not working at Netscape right now, because they could be like Google or Facebook, is because of tech debt. Killed us. Remember the browser wars?
Oh, yeah.
We lost them. But we lost them through tech debt, not because Microsoft used monopoly powers. That's what the court decided a few years later, but it's because we messed up and tech debt killed us. It almost killed eBay. Lost 30% of their market cap because of tech debt issues, but they survived. So the point is, you do need to care about tech debt. And it's ultimately the responsibility of the chief technology officer, the head of technology, head of engineering. And sometimes those heads of engineering complain to me that they're not working on tech debt because the head of product says we can't afford it. Ooh. And I always tell them, well, first of all, bad on you because you're even asking the head of product. Because it's not up to the head of product. But second, just to point out the obvious, it's you that will be fired. Right? The head of, that's who gets fired. If things get too bad, that's who gets fired. And even though they might say, but the head of product wouldn't give me any, resources, they're only giving us 5% or something like that. So you're bad for asking. It's not up to product. Normally, the way it works is the head of product and the head of technology have this discussion before you're in big trouble, and you say, all right, what level of investment needs to be done on an ongoing basis? The minimum is 20%. So if you've got 100 engineers, the equivalent of 20 of them would be working on tech debt related things on a separate backlog, usually called the tech debt backlog, managed not by a single product person, but by the CTO and the architects and the senior engineers. And they do whatever they want, basically, whatever they think is right. It's not up to us to second guess them, just like, they're kind of trusting the product people. Product people trust the engineers to decide this. What's the right technology stack? What are the right components that need to be done, redone? But in exchange for that 20% or 30% or whatever it is, they never come say we have to stop and rewrite. Because what we're trying to avoid is that situation where we say it's so bad we have to stop and rewrite. Because that's what most companies don't survive.
Can we put some numbers on it, like some dollar figures?
Well, that's why I said minimum of 20%.
Yeah, but geez, dollars.
Well, it's $. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's 50%, 20%. Now, the worst case, if you're in really bad shape, would be 50%. So it's somewhere between 20 and 50%. Yeah. Yeah. It shows up visibly because everything slows way down. Not just slow down runtime, but slows down. The engineers apologize for everything you ask. They're like, well, last company, this would have taken me less than a week. Here, it's more like 3 months because we're going to have to go change these legacy systems, and every time we touch them, we break everything else. You've seen the symptoms. But the general rule of thumb is minimum of 20% of the engineering capacity is always going to tech debt work. And sometimes the engineers will prefer to do that like every 4th or 5th sprint is tech debt work. That's fine. Sometimes they actually have a separate group that does the tech debt work. And sometimes they embed a person on each team. That's kind of a nice solution too. But it's really up to the CTO.
So in companies where the responsibility is associated with the partner, how is the best way to approach training communication when it's setting out from the community and saying, this is why we need the money for it? The first question most people ask is, who built it and why?
In other words, yeah, well, I mean, I don't really want to deal with that scenario because you're already in serious trouble, even nothing to do with tech debt. So we're describing a model here where the product owner is really, well, not the product manager, it sounds like. They're more working with the engineers. So, and if the product owner is actually the tech lead, then that wouldn't be such a problem. But if they're not the tech lead, they're an intermediary, we got bigger issues. So that's why I started this at the beginning. That's a disease you want to eradicate here as soon as possible. That comes from that's really old, and I mean really old, from like 30 years old. Yeah.
How far would you break down the product manager role when you've got a sort of a product but a bunch of interfaces and you sort of building new features on and so on? Is it I'm confused about a product manager across that, or how much to kind of split up that role?
Well, just to be clear, every product manager has a product team. A product manager that doesn't have the designer is only true if you have a user-facing component. But if there is, then a designer and then some number of engineers. A product manager without a dedicated set of engineers, somewhere between 2 and 12 engineers, that's not a product manager, it's something else. It might be a manager of product managers, it could be product marketing, could be different jobs. So that's what we mean by a product team. Now, then the question is, all right, I set a pretty high bar for a product manager. You should probably agree. One way companies deal with this, oh man, how do you find good people, is they split the job in half and they give business-facing people product manager title, engineering-facing people product owner title. I hate that because I don't know a single strong company that works that way, and I think I know why. So that's why I don't like that model. Instead, what we do is we separate the job a different way. So there's one person for the product role. And instead, they stop playing designer, so no more doing wireframes. right? Stop playing designer. Stop playing project manager. Now that's a bigger issue. That's not really an issue for startups, but for medium and large companies, that takes a lot of time. Stop playing QA. That also takes a lot of time. Acceptance testing is like 1% of actual quality assurance, right? So it's nothing compared to the real quality job. And stop playing product marketing. Those are the 4 areas that usually make the job an untenable job if they're doing one or all of those 4. And so we'll peel those off and focus on the product job.
So would Uber have a separate product manager for the driver rep versus a user rep?
Well, they do, yeah. But in truth, today that they have many product managers on each, but because they're big now. But early on, like I was there at early eBay, we had a buyer team, a seller team, a search team, and a trust and safety team. Now I was just visited eBay again recently, and now there's like 200 teams. It's massive.
This is a really hot topic because it's very common for New Zealand medium to large size companies to have product manager, product owner, and a BA. So those are the three.
Well, it's clear that you have
layers.
plenty of money. You just need to you wasted money left and right. But no, this is just IT legacy. This is my it might have come from somewhere else, but this is very common when banks have had a big influence.
Yeah.
But this definitely isn't how a tech product company would spend that money.
So how would you turn that around and influence that change?
Well, so the first thing I would do is argue to the leadership that let's try an experiment. And let's create a pilot team that actually works in the way. Usually what I do, honestly, is a little bit of, I get to know, I'm usually introduced to the CEOs, usually by an investor. And I'll like, well, tell me about which companies you think are awesome. And some of them just adore Netflix. They just think everything they do is great, or Amazon, or whoever. And then it's usually one of the companies that I know well and is using a very different way of working. I'm like, okay, I think they're a great example, but just so you know, they work nothing like you do. And we should talk about, I think you'd benefit from working like Netflix does, so why don't you do an experiment? And so you just for that team, you try this other experiment. And I think that is going on. I know that, is it Westpac or West Bank? Westpac Bank. I was just visited them again this morning, and they are running some of these experiments. It sounds like they've gone quite well, and so the rest of the company is now taking note. But that's kind of the normal way it would spread. And I should also mention, give the book to the CEO. That's what the book is. That's a big part of its job, is to be something that the executive team can learn. Yeah.
Just following up on what you touched on earlier, how do you peel away the QA and project management roles if you've got no people hired for that purpose?
If you've got no people?
Hired specifically for that purpose.
Well, it sounds to me like you in general have no shortage of people. But the problem is they're in the wrong roles. So yeah, if we had a business analyst, we would typically give them, they often can play, they're usually qualified for a project manager kind of role. They're qualified for QA kinds of roles. Some of them do become great product managers. I don't want to mislead, but most of them don't. Most of them, it's a very different role that they were hired for as a business analyst.
You've got no BAs?
We don't have BAs normally. We don't do a lot of documentation, first of all. So, right, and not in a typical team. We'll do prototypes. So it's not about spending more money either. I'm saying, you might not have a designer in your scenario. You might have a product manager, product owner, business analyst, but no UX designer. So instead, we'd have one person doing the product role, a product manager, a real product manager, and we would have one person doing the design role. And then if it's a medium to large company, a project manager will be hugely helpful. We don't always call it project manager today in product companies because it's got a lot of baggage associated with it. And it kind of, when Agile came, the Agile kicks out the business analysts and kicks out the project managers. With the BAs, that's not really a problem as long as you replace it with a real product manager. But with the project managers, it is often causes a problem. And so I use, and a lot of the teams I know have adopted the Spotify term for this, a delivery manager, but it's a project manager. It's just got the right personality. Yeah.
I was interested in your comments about the outcome-based roadmap. How have you seen like organizations move from a feature-based roadmap to more of an outcome-based roadmap?
It's that process I was alluding to. It normally I tell people it can take as long as a year, but you and I've documented that process too. There's an article, the alternative to roadmaps. It's called. Just Google that term, and it'll describe that weaning process. But it's just about for that first year, you would just be referencing the outcomes for every time you reference that feature, and you're training the organization to look at the business result. Yeah.
You touched on every product manager should have a product team, and within culture, how does a virtual team work, or should everybody in that product team report line manage to that product manager?
No, definitely not. Remember, the product manager is not the boss of anybody. So now, but you notice we can talk all we want about product teams, it doesn't change reporting structures. Normally, even though it doesn't have to be this, but almost everywhere it has a functional org structure. So that says that all the engineers report to directors of engineering, or dev managers, whatever you want to call them. All the designers report to head of design. All the product managers report to head of product. They're assigned to a product team. They sit with their product team and they work with the product team, to be honest, usually for years. They can still get promoted within that, but they're on a product team. So we don't have to mess with reporting responsibilities. And yeah, years ago it was tried to actually put them under it was usually the product manager that they picked, because the CEO or product thing, but that rarely went well. I mean, it actually was horrible. So, yeah, the truth is, if you're trying to do that, there's no way you could do the job I described, because that's 2 full-time jobs. Yeah.
Quick question. If you could summarize accountabilities of the product manager that covers what
What do we hold the product manager accountable for?
Yeah.
The OKR results. That's why OKRs are such a big deal. So they're given a set of business objectives, usually on a quarterly basis, and that's the one we hold accountable to the results.
And if your company's not adopting the design OKR model, would it be business objectives?
Yeah, it could be that. It's just some business problems to solve. Doesn't have to be the OKR model. Yeah.
Just leading question from there. What's common practice on product managers driving profitability or profits and losses?
P&L.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it used to be, this is how we would phrase it, they had P&L, but the reason we normally phrase it now by OKR or business objectives is because imagine you work at Facebook. The only one that really has P&L is Zuckerberg. Everybody's doing one little piece of a much bigger. So it doesn't really make sense to talk in terms of P&L anymore. We're all doing services, we're all doing multiple teams that contribute into a single bigger thing. So P&L just doesn't mean much. When I first started in product, it did, because HP had a big portfolio of lots of smaller products, and they could all be sold independently. That's almost never the case anymore.
Excuse me, we'll have to take one last question.
There's been a hand up back here.
Oh, great.
Oh.
You talked about strategy, how hard / impossible it is to transform strategy. Do you have examples from anywhere in the world where that has successfully happened on scale? But, sorry, not strategy, culture.
Oh,
culture. Transforming culture. Have you got examples from anywhere where that has successfully happened?
Yeah, I actually have several examples, but it is, like I said, it is hard. In the banking community, ING is kind of a poster child for this. In the, because I've been making fun of banks a lot for this, so I need to really. One of my favorites is a company called CarMax. You heard of them? CarMax, because CarMax had a sister company which was called Circuit City. They both started at the same time by the same owners, and Circuit City basically got taken out by Amazon, which gave a wake-up call to the CarMax, and the CarMax decided they had to get serious about digital, so they made a major transformation. Another great example, and I actually wrote about it in my book, and you can also find it in an article called Behind Every Great Product. Adobe, which actually already had a good company culture, but it was from the era before the internet. They actually were a pre-internet company. So they had great tech skills, but they didn't have sort of SaaS skills. And so it's kind of another layer on, and they did a major transformation that became actually one of our, I'd say Adobe and Slack are the two biggest success stories in enterprise B2B right now. Yeah.
If I can, I'll ask you to give your usual round of applause.